Hey, little helpers. As Kimmy and I careen through our 30s, and so do many of you, questions about having kids start coming up. And we've done episodes on fertility, we've done episodes on early parenthood and postpartum depression. But one thing we haven't touched upon is what happens if you actually don't have kids at all? I work at the fertility center at Duke right now, and actually so did Kibby. And so I've gotten used to treating people who are trying to have kids and really, really fear that they never will. And I wanted to see what happens in the worst case scenario, the quote, worst case scenario. Is it so terrible to never have kids? And then what about on the other side, people who never wanted kids to begin with? What's it like for them? So we are going to do today's episode on the childless and the child-free. When diving into this research, I found actually kind of a lot of contradictory information, particularly about the long-term effects of not having kids. And I do want to make a note quickly about this distinction that I'm going to make about childless versus child-free. So people who want kids but can't have them have been termed in the research literature as involuntarily childless, versus people who never wanted kids, decided not to have kids, are called the child-free. When I looked into the involuntarily childless research, there were a few things that kind of muddied the research waters. One was that most of the studies I found tended to happen very soon after failed fertility treatments, or they would conflate involuntarily childless with infertile, which meant that some of these women could still be in fertility treatments and then could actually wind up having kids in the end. Or they just wouldn't be far out from fertility treatments when women had kind of accepted that this was what their life was going to look like. And that made kind of a massive difference, because we know that people struggling with infertility who are in fertility treatments have distress that is at the same level of people diagnosed with HIV or cancer. And so the involuntarily childless research is pretty grim. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is 10 years out. So I don't know, Kibby, what were you able to find anything about the involuntarily childless?
Well, I'm really happy we're doing this, because I've thought about these topics, like what is it like to not have children, anecdotally, and I hadn't really thought about looking at the research for this, because I spent 2 years in fertility treatments, and I had always been career oriented, that, and I, stupidly, I guess, I just took it for granted that when I wanted to have kids, I will have them, right? Mm-hmm. I just was so focused and so anxious about, can I get a career off the ground, that I was just like, yeah, and then at some point I'll have kids. And then you're in it now where you're like in your 30s, the clock, even though we have now like egg freezing and like different options now, it still feels like a clock, like, okay, this is time.
It still is, because egg freezing doesn't guarantee anything.
Yeah. I mean, we have no guarantees, which is kind of a scary thing. And you're at that stage in life where it feels like shit or get off the pot, right? It's like, oh my gosh, like now it's time to really make this decision. And I realized that there was no other decision like this. I'm trying to think if that's accurate, whatever. But it really felt like you decide to have kids at a certain time, and if you don't have kids, then you can't actually reverse that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, if I decide not to have kids and then I change my mind when I'm 40 or 50, that's going to be a lot harder, right? Versus like careers. At this point in our country, you could change it around. You could do something else. You go back to school, right? There's actually a lot more flexibility in other kinds of decisions. But like having kids as a 30-year-old woman, it becomes like this, make the decision now or you're never going to get it again kind of choice. So
No,
it's like high pressure.
That's completely how I feel. And also, guys, if you hear background noise, my cat is purring on my lap and will be more annoying if I kick her off. So that's that noise. Yeah, I mean, I'm in a position where a lot of my friends are either a few years older than me or are not in PhDs, both of which mean that they're having babies before me. And it's very mixed reviews. It's either like, oh my God, seriously think about this decision. It upends every single part of your life and it's very, very, very difficult. Or it's like, this is the greatest joy in the entire world. You have to do it. You'd be missing out on the greatest love of all. I mean, it's like, oh my God, okay. And, like oh my God, sorry. Sissy, stop it. One of those people is my partner, who had a kid when he was really young and had to work so much and absolutely loves being a dad, but also has never gotten to relax because of it. And it's just these kinds of considerations, like what does this mean for... I'm like really into art right now. What does it mean for getting to do the things that I love? Will I ever have a chance to paint again? Or like read a full book again? And will I ever travel again? And I mean, I think the answer to all these things is yes, but it's just curbed. And yeah, it's like, I just have to jump in, and I don't know that anybody when they're having a kid feels like a fully formed adult. It just feels like you have to jump into an ice bath, and it's like something you've been trained to always want, and I have always wanted it. It's always been the default, like I am going to have kids, and that's still the case. But reading some of this child-free research was a little bit illuminating. And it's one of these things where, like, I have no idea how it's going to go down. One, because I don't actually know what it's like to be a mom. I've never even had younger siblings. So I never had to care for a little kid. So I have no idea what that's going to be like. Once you have the kid, it's out. You can't do anything about it. And the other thing is because you don't know what kind of kid you're going to get.
Yeah, it's a huge gamble. And it's almost like... we're trying to look into the research to see if there's an answer of should I have kids or not? Is this a good idea, right? And to introduce some choice, or at least like some informed decision making to something that a lot of, at least like I speak for myself, like women take for granted. Like I know this is my path, but now people are making all sorts of decisions, right? We have the power to do it. A lot more people, I think, now are deciding not to have kids. And it's really interesting to make that decision as a 30-year-old, not knowing what life is going to look like when you're 50, 60, 70s with or without kids, right? That's a lot of time. That's a lot of life that's impacted by this decision we're making now. So it's
the rest of it. It's the rest of your life. Yeah.
Yeah. It felt more, these questions were introduced to me when I was going through fertility treatments and thought, oh my God, like what if I don't have kids? Like what if I am unable to have children of biological children of my own? Does that mean I want them so badly that I look into other options like donor egg or surrogacy or adoption? Do I want that? What does that look like? What would life look like if I didn't have kids, right? So like I think when I had trouble conceiving, that's really when it felt like a loss. It felt like a loss of something that I took for granted that was something in my life, but then it was a little like it was presented now as a choice.
Yeah.
Whereas before I just could, it was like almost not a choice. It was like, all right, I'm gonna have kids now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm not in fertility treatments right now, but just working at the fertility center, I'm just inundated with these choices. My patients are making them. And it does kind of present this like, okay, do you really want kids or do you really want biological kids?
Interesting.
do you really want 3 kids, or actually would 1 kid be the compromise where, you know, you get most of your freedom, but you still get to be a mom and you still get that experience. And so, and then I think inflation is the other big thing. This, you know, I was watching Bill Maher, who I had mixed feelings about last night, but he was saying that a majority of Americans don't know how strong the economy is because everybody feels poor right now because of inflation. And the idea that kids are expensive has never been more relevant, where I'm actually thinking about reducing the number of kids I want simply because of that, because I just don't want to be poor and struggling all the time and arguing with my partner about money. And so it feels like the costs of having kids are, I mean, they've probably never been higher outside of like a recession.
Yeah, I heard that the biggest increases in expenditure is childcare these days. Yeah, so it's like, it's a real investment.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go into what I did find from the involuntarily childless research. And actually, I kind of had to rely on qualitative studies. So just for those of you all who don't know the difference between qualitative and quantitative studies, they usually have much higher sample sizes, and they will use things like measures like questionnaires, or maybe physiological measures like heartbeat, to basically get numbered values of information from a big swath of people. Whereas qualitative studies typically rely on interviews with a small set of people. I'm kind of oversimplifying it for the sake of this, because these studies were interview studies. But to be honest, like the studies that I found were pretty grim, but I do want to talk through that after I kind of go through them. So one qualitative study on involuntarily childless women who are 40 to 55 years old, which is like great. Okay, so now, I mean, the youngest cohort here might be just out of fertility treatment, but we've got some time. And one thing that was found was this complicated grief effect. So a lot of these women seem to have symptoms more akin to complicated grief than any other disorder. And the reason for this is that it's a really ambiguous loss. It's the loss of a dream. It's the loss of what could have been. It's not the loss of a particular tangible, person or thing. And so a lot of these women actually haven't gone through a normal grieving process or a healthy grieving process, because in a sense, they don't even know that that's what they're doing or that's what they need to do. They don't qualify this as, or characterize this as grief, because they're not mourning the death of someone. And that kind of brings up questions about okay, so how can we adjust complicated grief treatments for someone who doesn't have this tangible loss? New worries emerge, like that their husband could find a younger, fertile wife.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. That one was a bit of a gut punch, but honestly, that's how I would feel too with a different partner. I mean, I know Jason is cool either way, so that's helpful, but I get it, because honestly, if Jason were infertile, I'd be like, okay, are you willing to use donor sperm? I don't know.
Oh my God. Yeah, when you just said that, I felt the gut punch, because I remember I was infertile, and what's terrible about this is that who knows where the source of infertility is, right?
Yeah.
Like, men and women both have problems, but the women tend to take on the shame of it, right? The blame. And definitely that's the way I felt with my 2 years of infertility with my previous husband. And then I remember divorcing and then having to, think about dating and starting to date my now husband. And I remember one of the most painful, I wouldn't say it was a fight, but the time that I got really emotional and overwhelmed and shut down was when we started talking about like the fertility timeline. We were on vacation and we were just talking about like when we would start trying, and the idea he was suggesting to wait a little bit so he could finish grad school. But then I was like, all the shame of like I'm infertile, right? I don't have choices, and it's going to be my fault. And then if am I not able to produce, quote, quote, not able to produce a child, will that mean the end of our relationship? Or will that mean, that he would just like eventually leave to find someone else we were just younger and more fertile. So I can imagine that the complicated grief for women might also be like this kind of feeling of it might be my fault, like I'm broken, like oh God,
that all comes up. And I think even for women just in their mid-30s who maybe they don't know if they have fertility issues, but it is difficult to date. It is difficult to go on a first date and be like, I need to find out if this guy wants kids and like how quickly. And people don't. This what drives me crazy is that people don't know about the biological clock. They might think they do, but then these articles come out that, Cameron Diaz had a baby at 53 or whatever, and they don't say she must have used either previously frozen eggs or donor eggs. There's so many stories of people having, I hear this all the time. I'll be like, I need to have kids soon. And people will be like, no, my mom had a baby at 40. You've got time. It's like, no, your mom had time. A lot of women cannot have babies at 40. Everybody's body works differently. So people just think that it's like you're the same level of fertile until you're like 43 or something, and then maybe you're not anymore, but that's not true. It declines pretty sharply at 35. And so, and so dating is just, it becomes really pressured.
And then it's like the question, if you're dating and then you find someone who doesn't want kids, right? Or you can't have kids for whatever reason, are you going to stay with that person because you're choosing them, right? Like it's the dream that you find someone who wants to be with you no matter what, right? Like who says the magic words of, whether we have kids or not, I love you, I want to make a family with you, whether it's the two of us or with children, right?
But that's not always... Said.
Oh, that's so nice.
That's probably because he doesn't want to be poor and stressed out again.
Do you choose the partner, or do you choose the dream of having children or not children, right? It's like, what do you...
Dude, I've had so many friends and patients who are in these relationships where the men are like, I'm like 60-40, don't want kids, want kids. Or I'm 80-20. And they wait to see if they are worth the man changing their mind. And they run down their clock, and it gives me so much anxiety and so much frustration. Because I get that the man is like, well, that is how I feel. Like, maybe I'm open to kids. It's like, okay, but if you are with someone in their 30s, you got to figure it out and let her know. Because otherwise it's cruel.
I was just talking to a friend who is my age. I think she's like 36, 37, like around that age. And she's dating someone who has kids from a previous relationship. And she describes it as like 20% wanting it. Like he would be a no, but he says, I would if that's what you want.
Okay.
And she's like, I don't know, right? Like, it's really common for people to be like, I'm actually not sure if I want kids or not. That's kind of like actually what inspired this episode too, is like, then she has to make the decision, right? She has to be the one who goes, okay, yes, let's do it, and make my partner, who's like really farther on the fence, and that's a hard thing to choose, because then it's like, that has a lot of implications. It might change a relationship, it might change where I live, it might, this decision carries so much weight.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot imagine being that stressed out. Like, indecision about major life events, I mean, that's what threw me on Lexapro at first. And being with somebody who was trying to control me all the time. But I mean, being so much on the fence, just lodged there, and watching your time tick down, it's an awful feeling. So, anyway, and then probably one of the things she's worrying about is what these women also talk about as being a source of grief, is that they'll die without ever having had this experience. And yeah, I mean, so much of the way I think about having kids is like, this is the greatest love you'll ever experience. You get to watch psychology in action. You get to watch this little blob develop into a full person. You get to share your teachings with them. You know, you get to see how your genes look rearranged with somebody you love, and I mean, how that turns into a creature. You get a new sense of fulfillment. You get to see yourself change into a new role and take on, you know, put on a new cloak. And that's such a profound experience. And I am terrified of never having that. And I completely understand why people would regret that. Then there's this sense of meaninglessness. What is my worth and value? This one's a killer. Lack of evidence of positive outcomes of involuntary childlessness to draw hope from. We need this research. And we need people to step up. Well, we don't need it, but it would just be nice, I guess. If people who couldn't have kids and who actually wound up loving their child-free lives could share that experience with people. And then there's the question that you and I talk about, which is who will take care of me when I'm older? And I still don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, I imagine that's really culturally different because, you know, even just seeing in the US where like the idea of putting your older parents into a home or somewhere else, right? And, you know, that's more common here than in Hong Kong, where my family's from, where it's so different to be an older person there. There's so much respect for elders. Like, there's a lot of... It's like here, all the eyes are pointing to the young people as, like, the focal point. And in Hong Kong, it feels like the opposite. All the eyes are pointing to the older people. You, like... Everyone like gathers around them and works hard to, you know, make sure they have regular, you know, gatherings with them. Like, it's when the older you get, the cooler your life looks because people are really into you and really into like taking care of you. Whereas here, that's a question. And so
yeah, it sounds very lonely to be old without kids. But maybe it's not. And that's another story I would like to hear is like, is it that lonely, or do you have more freedom to build community when you don't have kids? I don't know if I would buy that necessarily, because 90% of Americans do have kids, and so it might be harder. But if you're child-free, like, do you find child-free communities and kind of grow up with each other and take care of each other, and that's how you spend old age? I don't know. But I know that's one of my bigger fears, and it feels like a sort of a stupid reason to have kids. Like, it's very practical. Then I have to remember that I have very profound reasons for having kids. But I do understand that anxiety.
I mean, I think, you know, to counter the research that you are quoting, there is a study looking at over 40 years of data from like the General Social Survey, about like 14,000 adults from 50 to 70 age range. Cool. And it's really consistent that older parents with minor children still at home are less happy than their empty nest contemporaries by 5 or 6 percentage points. It's children in the house make men less happy. I don't think that's a surprise.
This is when the data starts getting muddy, is when we talk about, do kids actually make you happier? Let me just real quick run through some coping mechanisms of involuntarily childless women, just because I want to make a couple points about how we can maybe shift some of the outcomes that we're seeing from this involuntary group to the child-free group, where the data, I mean, spoiler alert, is going to look very different. So some of the things these women did were they accepted their identity as a childless woman, and we know, like, the primary tool we use in the fertility center is acceptance. It's this idea that so many of these women come in, and these men come in, and they are very, very attached to their life looking a very particular way. They want X number of kids at Y ages, and they'll never be happy if this doesn't happen. And of course, when you go through fertility treatment, you're spending a lot of money on making this dream come true, so you become even more fused to it. It's very hard to accept that actually life can happen to you, and that life has a bounty no matter kind of what path you walk down. You know, I mean, as long as you're happy, or as long as you're healthy, you have a good social life, whatever. So being able to turn to acceptance and say, okay, life, do to me what you will. You know, like, I am now a childless woman, a child-free woman. That is who I am. I am no longer turning away from that identity. I'm bringing it on, and I'm going to approach life that way now. It's a way to help. Choosing to move on from the grief and find new goals. Yeah, I mean, this is... You don't have to stay stuck in this life that you don't want to be living. It could instead be, okay, what does this child-free life offer me that otherwise I wouldn't have? And it turns out, we'll see from the child-free literature, it offers a lot. Taking responsibility for the positives in your life. One woman said, I look at what I've got and I think, you did this. This is because of what you've built. So many women, I think, get stuck in the stigma of not having kids, or the sense of failure at not having kids, and they live there. And then actually broadening out and saying, okay, you know what, I don't have kids, but that was my body's doing. What I built was my awesome career, my friend circle, this house that I bought, you know, these hobbies I have, and really owning that. And then I really, really love this one. Reconnecting with a past self. So some of these women reported realizing that they still have the same enthusiasm and interest they did when they were 25. And when they were 25, they weren't thinking, my life sucks because I don't have kids. When they were 25, they were probably thinking, I don't want kids. I've got too much to do. And when we get into our 30s and it feels like this is the major choice we have to make, and if we decide to have kids and then can't have them, then everything is lost, then it's like, oh my God, all I am is just this meaningless husk, when actually no, like, you pretty recently were somebody who had a really full life without kids. Can you reconnect with that former self? And so all of this is to say, I think a lot of these outcomes for involuntarily childless women and men are really grim, but they're maybe not taking into account what happens if you get therapy and heal. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and you really process this complicated grief, and you really find out how to wear this new identity, and look at your life as something that's bountiful and has a lot to give you. And obviously your outcomes are going to be worse if you really, really wanted something and you couldn't have it than for people who didn't want it in the first place. But what we're going to see from the child-free literature is that it's not an objective truth that kids make you happier. Mm-hmm. It's not like we know it's an objective truth that friends make you happier. Yeah. But it's not so with kids. And so we can now go into,
I think that's a really good point. I think what we're talking about is the research that's applicable to people who really wanted kids and found out that they can't have it, right? So it's like, as you're saying, a dashed dream, like a loss of a dream. Someone who has to change their view of what they wanted their future to look like, what they wanted to get out of life. And it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for therapy to step in and help a person, like with any loss of a dream, right? It could be career, it could be, you know, like many, many different ways of how to accept that, how to find opportunities in that loss, right? Mm-hmm. All the grieving processes. So that's like actually sounds very hopeful for people who like wanted kids and who weren't able to have it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can turn to the child-free literature now and look at, like, there are actually pretty positive outcomes of not having kids. I would say the most divided data I saw was with men.
So in this general social survey, as men get older, men who are fathers are more likely to report being very happy the older they get. So,
and therefore the older the kid gets.
Yeah. So old men are really happy if they have kids.
Yeah.
And it's complex, right? This is like, that's one data set. There's a lot of different things that go into it. But yeah.
Well, we've also found that men, not just the older they get, but as time has passed over the past 70 years, parenthood has made men much more happy than it did in the 50s when they didn't really have anything to do with kids. So it's interesting. Like, basically, this study that we're talking about right now showed that women are kind of bummed out by their kids. Their happiness decreases. It's lower than child-free women, but men, their happiness increases with the greater involvement that they have. And I guess I'm wondering, like, okay, so this could be a gendered thing where men just like kids more than women. That probably is not the case. It might be more like the increased involvement that men get is more enjoyable than the increased involvement that women get.
Anecdotally, yeah.
Right, the more men get to play with the kids and it doesn't impact their career, they just get nice time, versus women have to do maybe the brunt of the unfun stuff, and it does impact their career, then women get a little bit more bummed out. So, I mean, it's interesting because the more equitable the roles have gotten, the happier men are, but I guess I'm wondering if then that trend might start to reverse if it got even more equitable.
I mean, it is quite sad to look at, like, general happiness studies. There's one famous one by Harvard professor Dan Gilbert, and another one by Daniel Kahneman, looking at just, like, what makes people happy over their lives, right? And children do not make people happy. Like, people who have children tend to rate their happiness on a daily basis lower than people who are child-free. And the other study I'm looking at, we'll post this all on the website, but the General Social Survey, mothers are less happy than child-free women from the ages of 50 to 70, especially if the kids are at home. Now, okay, all right. I wouldn't necessarily take this as the whole answer to, like, should you have kids? Is it better to have kids or not? Because this is where how research is done will really come into play. If someone were to ask me, Kibby, are you happy right now? I would probably say no, right? Like, you know, because the way, if we understand happiness, like, does happiness mean I'm satisfied with my life? Do I feel like I'm living a meaningful life? Versus, like, am I enjoying myself in this moment, right? If I'm, like, feeling the emotion of happiness, I could say that I feel fulfilled with my kid.
Right.
Do I feel happy on a, you know, if you're to look at me at any time taking care of my kid, like, often it's probably a no, right? Yeah. It's like, it's tough. It's like most of having a kid is the struggle part, where it almost kind of sometimes feels like a lot of the caretaking is like a relief of the bad feelings, where I'm worried that he's not eating enough. So, like, I'm trying to find him food that he likes, or he's crying, like he's about to be 2, so it's, like, really present. So he's, like, screaming because I'm trying to put on his fucking socks, right? And so me just trying to put on the socks and try to calm him down, that's parenting. And it's probably, like, the worst feelings I've had compared to all the times that I was child-free and I don't know what I was doing when, you know, sleeping in. What was I doing, right?
That's what
however, yeah. Enjoy it. But would I say that I mean, you've asked me this before, like, is it worth it, right? And the times that I've really been struggling with parenthood, you've asked me, like, is this worth it? And there are days where I go, no. Yeah. And there are days where I go, yes. I know overall I would say I'm, quote, happier with kids than if I didn't, because that's what I wanted. But is it fun every day? No. Yeah. In fact, you know, you're saying, oh, the most love you've ever felt. No, frankly, the most love I've ever felt was being on MDMA at Coachella listening to Lady Gaga. Oh my God. What was it? Like a beautiful 2-hour-long set where she just sung her heart out and I'm, like, dancing with my friends and all the people that I loved. That was the most love I've ever felt. Yeah. I've had bits of it with my kid, but if you want to, like, don't believe the hype, right? There's times where you could chemically make yourself happier than having kids. Anyway. Go
No,
on.
I think that you bring up a super important point, which is, what does happiness really consist of? How are we operationalizing it? Is happiness actually the point of life? These women actually aren't saying that they feel like they'd be happier with kids or talk about meaning and fulfillment. I feel like I'd have a more meaningful life if I had kids. And that actually seems to be the replacement they need, is how can I find meaning in not having kids? It's not how can I find happiness in not having kids. So, I mean, there are some early studies that showed comparable life satisfaction between child-free versus parents, with child-free women having slightly more satisfaction in freedom, friendship, love, and financials. And then, yeah, the majority of studies did show positive correlation between child-free and life satisfaction. But, like, what is satisfaction? So that seems to be a different concept than happiness. That seems like maybe it could include more meaning, but I don't know. You'd have to really define that. And then the research subjects would also have to understand what they're actually answering. So I don't know. But it does seem like people who don't have kids wind up totally fine. They are maybe enjoying their life a little bit more. And if they don't feel like kids are where their life's meaning comes from, then great. I don't know if there is really a delta between parents and child-free people on meaning. It's difficult when that was where people thought that their meaning was going to come from and they're blocked from that. And then men, we've seen pretty bad outcomes for men who don't have kids. Research has shown that childless men have poor health outcomes, especially if they are unpartnered. And we know that marriage is better for men than women. Excessive drinking and smoking, depression, poor sleep, worse physical health, earlier death, and increased risk for suicide.
Oof, men, get going on your baby making.
Totally. Yeah, and then, I looked at this qualitative study of involuntarily childish. Was that a Freudian slip, or was that a Freudian slip? Involuntarily childish men. That sounds like a condition that many women are afflicted with. Yeah, I think one thing we're missing here, and this comes in really strong for men and women, is the role of stigma. So I'm seeing that both involuntarily childless people and child-free people, one of the biggest negatives in their lives are stigma. And it's not necessarily better for either of the genders. I mean, women might be seen as less feminine. Being called selfish is one of the biggest ones, which I think is just so stupid.
Yeah.
Is it really selfish to not have kids? You might think it's selfish to have kids. You have to create a new human in order to give yourself a source of meaning. But yeah, people see it as you don't want a kid because you don't want to take care of another person. You don't want to do the work. It's well, who says? Maybe you want to take care of different people. Maybe you want to take care of animals. So anyways, if you do that, don't do that. And men are often seen as weak or ineffectual. The shame of male sterility it's just its own unique hell, Men love to think of themselves as virile. It makes them feel more manly, which is a belief, not a fact, obviously. And what actually happens is that women, even though the stigma for them is just as strong and painful, they wind up actually pretending that they are the infertile one to save their male partner. The stigma.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not everyone does that, but there was a finding that showed that.
Oof.
Yeah.
Women just take so many for the team, don't they?
Yeah.
It does seem that it does also seem like the aging research shows far and above the way to age well, like people who are happy when they're older, are people who are A, physically active, and B, have good relationships. That's really strong findings in the aging literature. So if you are childless, or free, or have children, I wonder if the confounding factor is, do you have healthy relationships when you're older, right? Like if you're child free and have a great community, you might be happier than, if not. And maybe older people who have kids naturally are, they're in a different community. They have kids, grandkids, or whatever, so they have more interactions with other people. And definitely for men, that's the case, right? Men who are married and have families are a lot more social than men who are who don't. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting seeing the divide between men and women here. It seems as though marriage and kids are more important for men.
Yeah. Yeah. And harder for women.
and harder for women. And maybe that's because women are doing more work, or maybe it's because women without kids are just more capable naturally of building the social foundation for happiness than men are. So, I just I chuckle a little bit because it's usually when I talk to my friends, it's usually the men who don't want kids. Or my friends will be dating men who don't want kids. And I'm like, well, good luck out there excessively drinking and smoking. And I'm sort of kidding, but, I do think that child-free men need to be pretty intentional about their health and about their socializing to make sure that they can avoid these bad outcomes.
It's so funny. It really should now, thinking about the data, it should be the reverse. It should be that men are chase us for the chance to have kids, and we should be running away from it.
Well, that's how it works in the rest of the animal kingdom.
Yeah.
Right?
And yeah.
But then the men don't stick around, I guess, in most cases.
Yeah. It's easier to... Yeah. I mean, I think it's just... Thinking about all this data, it actually sounds kind of heartening and a little scary in the sense that there's not a real yes or no, you should have kids or not, right? It's not like a, binary oh yeah, people with kids are happier or less happy. It's a little bit like, what do you derive meaning from in life? And how can you adjust that sense of meaning and purpose to whether you have kids or not, right? So if you wanted them and didn't get them, then finding a new sense of meaning. Or if you find that you really want kids and have them, it's hard. But you might be happier in this life satisfaction of, having something that you really want, even though it's really difficult on a day-to-day basis.
I think my takeaway from all of this is really what I've been trying to get my patients to, which is that either way there are gifts. I don't have to be so attached to having 3 kids or 2 kids. And what will happen will happen, and that's a life that will be worth living either way. So I think I found this literature mostly a relief and also a little bit scary because I do at this moment want kids. It's like,
I will give people a heads up from the data and personal experience and watching, friends and myself, that the first year of having a kid, I think it's also whether you have kids at home and young kids versus you're 70 and you have adult kids. It's a very different picture, right? In the first year of having kids, marriages or relationships really suffer. And just to know that happens, that's really, you go from having all of your time together, you can really focus your love, affection, and resources on each other, right? And then suddenly you're pointing to this other thing, right? And you're tired, you're stressed out, you are, you become co-parents. And I think that adjustment is generally really difficult and comes with a lot of, a lot of changes and a lot of hardship. And couples therapy is really helpful for that. I say it from my own experience, really, really helpful. And also just patience, because it does get better over time, and not to just catastrophize and say, oh no, this is what it's going to be like forever. As kids grow up, it changes.
And that's, I think, especially a good message for you to give people, because you were stuck in that this is going to last forever thinking.
Yeah.
And you did have pretty bad postpartum depression, and to know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel is really powerful. And it seems like something that maybe there could be a cope ahead plan about, a loose one. Like, okay, partner, you and I are going to go into the baby tunnel for a year.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be having as much sex, and we're not going to be going on as many dates. Do we want to figure out, like, I don't know, a babysitter now that we can rely on? Do we want to figure out child care now? Do we want to have a system in place for what happens when we pull apart from each other? Do we want to get couples counseling now? Not because we're in trouble now, but because we might be later.
Yeah.
And we want to have the attitude of we're doing this together, and we are going to prioritize our relationship to the degree that we can.
Absolutely. Just for me, assuming that two people is not enough to take care of a kid. So whatever supports that you need to make that happen, whether it's babysitter, daycare, family, friends with other kids, like, two people is just not enough. It's too exhausting. And if you want to reserve some of your energies for each other, there's got to be at least another person or resource in play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, for those of you who maybe are struggling to have kids, or who decide not to have kids, maybe just opening a window a little bit to the idea that you may no longer have to save a ton of your money. You may no longer have to think about waking up really early for the rest of your life. You can engage in travel and hobbies that maybe you didn't think were worth starting, because when were you going to find the time? You can date differently without a clock. Or you can have a different kind of marriage. So maybe take a second to try to revel in what that could be like as well. If that feels inaccessible right now, that's okay. But it is there for you, waiting.
And if there's still a lot of purpose and value in nurturing the next generation or passing down something, there's so many other ways to do that, right? Teaching, mentorship, getting involved in organizations that do things for kids, right? Or animals, or there's other ways to give besides for your biological children. And that can be very meaningful.
Actually, in a qualitative interview with Child Free People, 2 women talked about how when they were thinking about not being mothers, they were like, wait a minute, just because I don't have a kid doesn't mean I'm not a mother. What is involved in being a mother? Like nurturing, support, care? Well, I can exercise all of those values in other ways. And so that was one way in which they didn't feel like they were missing out on anything.
Yeah.
So on that note, if you feel like you need an outlet for nurturing, caring, and supporting, giving us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and a nice little note, I think would basically serve that need. So we'll see you all in a couple weeks. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.